Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, this week I'm talking with sports psychologist Elliott Newell. Elliot, welcome to the Sports Psych Show, mate.
Hi Dan, thanks for having us.
No problem at all. Thank you for coming on. Why don't you introduce yourself? I know you work for the English Institute of Sport in the pathway there. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into sports psychology and what you now do with the English Institute of Sport?
Okay, well, as you said, my background's in sports psychology. I've fulfilled a number of different roles in that. Spent some time lecturing, what feels like many moons ago. Did a lot of consultancy work initially when I first started. I guess coming out of professional practice qualifications was trying to build up that consultancy network and doing quite a lot of one-to-one stuff with athletes. And then I got into Olympic sport for the first time when I started doing some work with canoe, which was a sport that I'd never really got involved with before. But
you weren't a canoeist yourself?
No,
okay.
No, I tried it many times. Every time I got into a boat, it sank. I think that was more a weight management thing, but but I just loved it. It was such a cool sport. So this was slalom. I initially got into, and then did some work there at England level, and then progressed into the British programs where I started doing some work with sprint canoe, which was very interesting, and kind of built in full-time roles there, and that was very exciting. And then 3 years ago I joined the English Institute of Sport, and joined the Pathways team. So Pathways team are a pretty ambiguous team. It's just full of really creative and energetic people. It's such a cool team to be part of, and what we do is work strategically and project-based with all of our funded Olympic and Paralympic sports to address issues or challenges or questions that they might have around talent ID, talent recruitment, talent development, and then transition of talent throughout the pathway. So it's quite a diverse and exciting role. I'm not exclusively a psych in that role, but you never move far away from that stuff. So, that's me at the moment.
Let's take you back to the canoeing, because I think it's fascinating. What kind of things did you work on with canoeists?
To be honest, and I wonder if there's any psychs out there that can relate to this. So if you go into like a sport for the first time that you know nothing about.
Oh yeah, I've been there. Scary.
You do sports analysis, and you tend to find that, at least on the surface level, the performance skills required are pretty similar. So if you look at things like attentional control, emotional regulation, and things like that, they tend to be pretty consistent across a number of sports. What makes it unique is the context in which those skills are applied. So my background was football. I'd only ever really worked in football, and then suddenly come into this individual sport environment was interesting. So the psych skills needed across sprint and slalom are quite different. Sprint, as you imagine, is very race orientated, so it's a lot about managing self and managing pacing and race strategy. Probably the things that mean the most in canoe sprint performance are around technical execution, being able to deliver power in the right way and to pace well. Whereas in slalom, it's amazing. It was so much fun as a sight because it's just a box of frogs. So you imagine the complexities of white water, you imagine the complexities of gate positions and environmental things like wind blowing the gate, order in which you race, the fact that you've got 2 runs on a day. So a very, very psychological sport, as well as hugely physical and technical, both of them. But I found that most of my work was around helping those athletes manage the complexities and challenges inherent in a performance lifestyle and the performance training environment that they were in as much as it was about managing the psychological aspects of delivering a performance. So it made for a very interesting, diverse and busy workload.
That's really interesting. So you said there so much of your work was revolving around lifestyle, so away from the boat, I suppose, away from the canoe, that bared relation to how they would subsequently train and perform on a day-to-day basis. And then you've also alluded to training there, how I'm guessing how effectively they'd train, the psychology behind that, and both of those being more pertinent in your role than the performance itself.
We'd almost kind of it was through that work, and keep in mind I came from quite a consultancy based experience as a practitioner, and then I was thrown into this full-time work environment that suddenly we found it important to have conversations not just about how are you performing, and let's talk about the psychology inherent in your performance. How might we use psychological skills and principles to develop that or help you to perform? But then much of it was around, as you said, how do I train well? But also inherent in that training environment are relationships and cultures and managing different aspects of the environment that other canoeists, other squads, like there's just a whole load of stuff that comes with being able to train well. And primarily the limiting factor, I think, to people's performance was the fact that there were various psychological barriers or things that were influencing their ability to train well. So coaches and athletes used to call it the noise, the kind of emotional, psychological, behavioural stuff that gets in the way of being able to turn up and fully engage with and absorb the learning opportunity that's presented to you in the training session. And then to be able to get to yourself in a place where you can turn up ready to that environment, there's just a whole load of lifestyle stuff involved in that as well. And one of the big chunky bits of work I had at Canoe was managing a talent transfer squad. So we had 15 females between 18 and 24 that were coming into the high performance environment. None of them had been athletes before. We'd relocated all of them to come and train full time. So I could have been doing as much goal setting and mental skills as I would have liked, but there's just a whole heap of other stuff that we got to clear the decks with and support with to be able to do that performance bit well. So it all fell into this way of thinking about. So every individual that we worked with, I'd consider them as a performer and their ability to deliver a performance under pressure. We consider them as an athlete. So what does it take to be able to maximise my athlete lifestyle and to take the learning opportunities that are presented to me in my training environment? And then behind that, the person. So who am I outside of this environment, and how do I manage myself and my life and my ambitions and my everything else to do with me that then enables me to turn up to train, to find meaning in my training and find purpose in my life. That when you get those bits right, people tend to engage with learning opportunities a bit better, and by consequence, if your training's decent, people get better.
See, that last bit you said is really interesting, and that's you've kind of stole my thunder there, because I'm going to reflect back to what I'm hearing, and no, it's great because when we really strip it back, and I think this is what a lot of people don't always realise who are keen fans of sport and watch from the outside in. So they're watching an Olympic event and they're seeing a performance in that moment, so they're seeing that canoe run, if you like, and I'd never considered about the weather, but obviously I understand that the weather can create choppy waters, but you forget about the gates and having to go through the gates and how they can blow the gates, and that's got to make a difference. And so subsequently you're watching that performance and you're watching that canoeist who's got to be an absolutely incredible self-manager, from moment to moment, because anything can go wrong. And they've got to complete that run in as quick as possible and as accurately as possible. Now, how do they enable themselves to do that at the highest possible level under pressure, well, they have to train effectively. They have to develop the skills, whether they're mental skills or technical skills, to go through those gates when the weather is terrible, when the wind is blowing the gates around. So they've got to be great trainers, but to be great trainers, there's a mental load related to that. But then you draw it back, as you're alluding to lifestyle. If that canoeist doesn't have a lifestyle that is congruent with the ability to effectively train every day, which ultimately then leads to high performance under pressure. But it does, when you draw it back down in simple terms, it starts with the lifestyle, doesn't it? My ability as a performer to manage myself outside of my sport on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And that's why whenever I talk to people about these ideas we had in canoeing about performer, athlete and person, we always presented it as an iceberg. And the bit at the top of the iceberg was the performer, because that's the bit you got to see.
Yeah.
That was the performance. But sitting behind that was just so much. And we can talk quite intimately about the behaviours and characteristics of elite performers, and we can run workshops and develop schedules around, well, this is what high performers do. You need to sleep X amount, you need to eat and rehydrate and do all of this stuff. And that works really well if people are robots, but they're not. And whilst it was partly about education, and particularly around these kind of new guys that were coming into this high performance lifestyle for the first time, there's a lot of education, but most of the time people know what, in inverted commas, they should be doing. But that in itself is fraught with risk, because if this performance lifestyle is about maximising performance, and only about maximising performance, you lose balance. And if you lose balance, you get all the kind of potential risks around developing unhelpful perfectionism. There's mental health consequences. There's identity consequences for that. And then what do you do when the performance can't be delivered anymore and people leave programs? So we have this idea of how people should manage themselves. We know what's right and we know what's wrong, but helping people manage the inevitable ups and downs, the bits where that routine flows really nicely, the other bits where they just want to step back or chill out or do something else. So it's the magic and interest I found was, how do you work with people where they can adopt some of those high performance lifestyle principles into their life narrative, the life that they want to live, the person that they want to be? Then you help to create congruence, you help to create authenticity, you help to establish meaning and purpose behind that performance lifestyle that then allows people to crack on. Otherwise you just find yourself delivering a lot of workshops and a lot of mental skills training, and in some cases, as I've seen, end up being quite punitive or quite guilt or shame orientated, where we're almost like not cutting people slack for not nailing these brilliant basics every day, when the reality is it's pretty hard to do that. So I'm completely on board with that idea of person behind the performer first and foremost. Otherwise, nothing else is really going to make sense and probably won't stick in the long term.
Two words, balance and manage, that you mentioned there, balance. I suppose to the layperson looking outside into the Olympic Games, he or she might feel that there's no place for balance. How can somebody expect to win Olympic gold, or strive to win Olympic gold, and retain a lifestyle that contains balance? So, I mean, one question to you is, can people be Olympic champions and have some form of balance in life? And a second question off the back of that is, who's responsible? How does that balance happen, if it can happen, and who's responsible for that? Is it the athlete themselves, or is it the people in charge of the environment that they are walking into? Sort of an environment versus person athlete responsibility.
Yes, do you know what, really good questions. Your first one I think I heard was around, is it possible for balance?
Yeah, is it possible? Is it possible to be an Olympic champion? I mean, there's a lot of last few years. There's a lot of interesting debate around well-being and lifestyle, whether it's from British cycling or various British teams. Is it possible to have that balance and be an Olympic champion?
I'm going to do that really annoying psych thing and just say, yeah, but it depends.
It depends, yes.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But they're certainly, in my mind, not a single or unidimensional definition of balance. Okay. If you were outside looking in, I imagine that lifestyle would look inherently weighted towards athletic performance, which it should be, and in some cases in most cases is absolutely necessary that it is. You can't get to the top of the world in a really competitive event or sport if you're doing it part-time in some cases. The balance I'm referring to, I guess, more is that psychological balance. So does the amount of time that this person's dedicating to this pursuit, is it what they want? Is it what they need? Is it what's good for them? Does it make sense in the life story that they want to write for themselves? For some people it doesn't, but for some people it does. So the balance is, I guess, just being able to maintain motivation, energy, engagement, and well-being whilst pursuing that athletic dream, which, if we were to balance it in terms of time and effort, as I said, would be massively weighted towards the performance. But the balance comes because that makes sense to the individual and it's what they want to do. It's when you get into situations where there's a perceived imbalance. So as an example, I remember one of the canoeists I work with was always asking for more, wanting to train more, wanting more information, wanting more exposure, wanting more international competition. But the balance wasn't right because the training load wouldn't have made sense. It wasn't right in her trajectory in terms of the stage-based approach we were trying to secure for her development. You know, it's not all and now. And we almost said, well, do you know what, this feels quite intense. Is this what's right for you right now? And we kept an eye on it for a while, and then this was an athlete who was just stripping back everything in her life to pursue this performance. And the balance was achieved just from her staff, and we just rallied round her and said, look, is this right for you? And just through those discussions it emerged that she thought that's what she should be doing. That the perception she had is that that's what Olympians do. I need to do this. I need to commit my entire life to it. But it was only through the fact that we had really good relationships and monitoring that we could say, well, actually, the more you try, the less we're getting out of it. The performance development isn't happening. The performance aren't being delivered. We think this is too much. Maybe we can get more in a performance context by just stripping things back. And then to counter that, there was someone in the exact same squad who was training full time and said, this isn't making sense to me. I'm enjoying the canoeing. I'm not enjoying it every day. Can we have a chat about uni? Can I just go and do something else to help me achieve that balance? So the balance has to make sense in my mind to the person who's experiencing that lifestyle, but it has to be done with performance in the centre. So if the commitment from the athlete is to be the best performer they can be, to pursue this Olympic goal, then we have to find a way that gets it to work for them. Sometimes you have to have really difficult conversations and just say, actually, based on what we understand about your performance trajectory and what it's going to take to win, we don't think that this balance is going to work. But there's definitely been conversations I've had with athletes where we said, well, actually, yeah, I think this could work. Maybe we could add a different dimension to your lifestyle to help maintain well-being and performance. So it's a really long-winded way of getting around it, but you have to invest time in understanding the athlete and the story and map that against what is it that we understand it is going to take to win and deliver that performance that we're all committed to.
As you're speaking there, several things I'm thinking about. I mean, I've done a lot of work over the last 15 years in golf, obviously, because that's my background. And, it's as you're speaking, I'm thinking about this notion of there are the pathway to excellence. If excellence is the right description, or a pathway to the gold medal, or the pathway to the cup final, or majors, isn't necessarily straightforward. It isn't one-dimensional. There's not one way to do it, and it's really interesting as you're talking there. I think of there's so many young golfers with the emergence of Tiger Woods, sort of at the end of the last century and into the millennia, and suddenly there was this raft of young people from sort of 16, 17, 18 who would leave school at 16 and be off a scratch handicap and right, that's it, I'm going to play golf and I'm going to be the next Tiger Woods type scenario, and work, I'm going to work really hard, I'm going to practice for 8 hours a day, and they would just get worse. And it was largely they were over practicing, they were burnout. At 17, 18, 19, you don't necessarily have the emotional capacity to travel the world playing and competing, on at the highest level in golf. And so often I'd be saying to golfers, look, is there a different way here? Can you actually get a golf scholarship to an American university or British university and stop? Come on, let's just take a bit of time here. Is there another way? Because actually going a bit slow, the hare and the tortoise, maybe we need to be the tortoise here rather than the hare, because the hare is going to burn you out. Whereas if you're the tortoise, you will reach your destination and you may well win that race, or you give yourself a best chance to reach that destination. You give yourself the best chance to get to where you want to go. But if you're the hare, you might just knacker yourself.
Yeah, and I think there's got to be a little tortoise-hare hybrid somewhere.
I like that.
Sometimes we are bound by time, and my world is defined by 4-year cycles.
Yeah.
So sometimes it might be, well, you'll get there in the end, but sorry, the Olympics was 18 months ago. So there's striking that performance trajectory that I think, as long as athletes are committed to, it's a responsibility of the staff to help maintain them on that. So quite often it's a performance focus. So when we're online for performance, but the balance, I think, comes with 3 key factors. And I always talk to athletes a lot about this, is that if we're looking for balance, we need to make sure that what we're currently doing is best for your performance, because we are in a performance setting and you've made quite an ambitious commitment to performance. But is it also right for your well-being, and is it all what the best thing for your learning? So quite often we can do things that are really useful. We deliver performance, we feel really good, but we're not learning. Or we can have a situation where our balance or our current situation is where, well, we're learning and we're performing, but we're sacrificing our well-being. So everything around what I ended up trying to do in canoe, and has been my messages since I've moved into more strategic roles within the Olympic Paralympic system, is around how do you strike up the balance between learning, well-being and performance. Because it's often in those moments and those periods in the pathway where we get the best outcomes. I think it's interesting that you bring up the idea that learning and well-being are equally, if not sometimes more important for performance at different times, even though we operate in performance settings.
So we've agreed we need to create a genetically modified tortoise hare, basically, is what we need. We don't necessarily need the hare, but we have to be careful that we don't want to turn an athlete into a tortoise, so we need somewhere in between, the genetically modified tortoise hare. And I know you're very heavily invested in your work around how can we help an athlete thrive in this environment. It's about helping them thrive in an environment. And so it's about shaping an environment that helps athletes develop to perform. So in your work now, what work are you doing with coaches to implement the most positive environment, the environment that's going to create those tortoise hairs?
I'd actually stumbled upon a way of working in canoe where I would not work so much with athletes one-to-one on skill development.
Okay.
I would spend a lot of time with them, but mostly just chatting, finding out their experience, how's it going, how do you feel, how's the balance. We would interject where appropriate and plan for some skill development, which some of them wanted to do. But most of my time was with the coaches. And it was the coaches who, in my mind, were the orchestrators of those environments. They were the programmers. They were the critical relationships that would impact learning, well-being and performance most. Since I've moved into the EIS, I've actually spent, quite depressingly in my head, time in meeting rooms and more time in workshops than I have with coaches. I guess my commitment is to spreading these messages across our system, and with 30 odd Olympic and Paralympic sports, it's quite a big beast to manage.
Who are in those workshops then, mate? Are they not coaches? Are they
sometimes
performance directors and stuff?
Yeah, sometimes they are, but when I was working on the ground, I'd follow my nose and I'd spend all this time working with athletes and their problems with a coach. So I thought, well, I'll just stop working with you and start working with the coach. And then I start working with the coach, and you find out that a lot of the issues that they experience and the reasons why things are playing out the way they are because of management or because of the system or the way things are set up. So it's kind of why I've stepped into that space to try and influence in that area. So I'm spending a lot of time at the moment working with people who are responsible for systems. So that would be heads of talent, pathway leads, sometimes performance directors, but most of our work is in around the lower end of the performance pathway. So it's bringing people in. So they have various degrees of interest. Heads of sports science, coach developers, and head coaches. It's a bit of a eclectic mix. So our last event, we run a system-wide symposium, and about 100 people turned up, all from those different coach, practitioner, leader backgrounds. And then I'm heavily involved in some more specific programs. So I run a program called the Performance Pathway Program, which is for pathway leads. A lot of those discussions with those people who are responsible for the strategic way in which a pathway or talent pathway is run. And then I have some less involvement, more of a contributory role to another program that our team run, which is for pathway coaches, which is around unearthing problems that coaches face and helping them make sense of those problems. And quite a lot of that is, the whole thing is biopsychosocial in nature, but quite a lot of my contributions are around how do we construct an environment that allows people to thrive, and how do we offset some of this stuff that we have embedded, I think, in some language and some culture in performance systems around the ease with which we can take a look at what's wrong with the athlete, as opposed to what might we be doing as individuals and a collective system that might be encouraging some of the problems that we're seeing.
Interesting. So again, with the notion of stripping things back, we've got the performer at ground level, we've got the coach there, kind of overseeing the ground level, and then we've got the systems leaders at up in the helicopter, essentially, haven't we? The heads of talent, the heads of performance, the head of sports science, the performance directors, essentially. So what kind of conversations, what kind of interventions are you speaking about with these heads of performance and heads of sports science? What interventions are happening at a systemic level that's driving coach behaviour?
So it could be something as simple as when and how do we deliver our review process?
Okay.
So, reviewing athletes is a normal, necessary part of the role.
Yep.
How do we want that to feel from an athlete's point of view? what are we trying to get out of that? And we have some quite useful discussions around what different review processes look like. And it's striking how many are performance-driven only, how many are data-driven only. And, we end up having discussions around the anxiety that we might feel by doing reviews that aren't objective. And, it's just talking to that systemic anxiety that is inherent in all of our systems. Well, how do we bring that to the table and have those discussions that mean that we can better facilitate a development experience for an athlete rather than almost kind of giving them our nerves through the processes we deploy. So you see in quite anxious systems that the tendency seems to be to draw everything really close to the leader. So that is quite a lot of control, quite a lot of policy, quite a lot of data-driven decisions. What does that look and feel like for an athlete, and is that the kind of experience that we want to create? Obviously, the big one in our world is funding. Everything is driven by funding. How do we manage the consequences for funding decisions? How do we manage ourselves in an environment that is set up to reward performance? And how do we manage those moments where we have opportunity to do what's right for the person versus do what's right for performance, get that medal that we need to secure future funding? So there's loads of different things, and most of my stuff at the moment is working with people to unearth those problems and challenges inherent in their work and find different ways to relate to them, so that we don't have this way in which control and anxiety and misinformation, miseducation in some cases, filter down into practice. So that could be something as severe as, well, we're funded on medals, we only want medals, coaches feeling that they just need to do whatever they need to do to deliver a performance, and then athlete well-being suffering. Or it could be something as subtle as something like a system is set up in a way that doesn't afford a pathway leader time to educate themselves on the latest development in talent recruitment, for example. So they end up running recruitment programs that are ill-judged and misinformed and isn't going to help them make the right decision. So they end up recruiting the wrong people. It's just all of those kind of systemic stuff that we can probably get more joy out of, and certainly from a psychological point of view around creating the right environments and systems for people to experience. So that's kind of what most of my work is at the moment, that alongside how do we support athlete transitions into, through and out of world-class programs.
Would you say when you're having conversations with these people at the top, so the people who are making decisions that are going to impact coach experience and impact performer experience, for me it starts with the question, what experience do our athletes want to have? What experience do our athletes want to have? With the notion that we need to ask them, what experience do they want to have, and how can a coach best serve this? Would you agree with me there, or would you see it in a different way?
I'm torn. I think I want to see it the same way. I'm not sure if that's how it plays out. I should probably qualify that I'm still following my nose on this and still kind of working my way up. So I'm not yet having those conversations with the people at the top. And everything that I operate within at the moment is around podium potential and talent program. Yeah, I can see that working really well if we're in a position where athletes feel like they have the knowledge and the autonomy to make those decisions certainly in some of the work I did in canoe, we would get into that stage as we were ready to hand athletes over to the senior program. But there were quite a lot of people, or young athletes, that are just like, tell me what to do. Like, geez, man, how much are you getting paid to be my coach and you want me to make the decisions? But I do think that there's value in considering first and foremost, what is the development experience we want someone to have when they're in our space. And I'm in this habit at the moment of creating models or thinking tools around a topic, and the one that we used in our last symposium, which was on development environments, had athlete experience bang in the middle.
Okay.
Because my experience would suggest that the experience someone has will dictate their learning to a greater extent than the actual activity that you have them do. Now, we can't hide the fact that activity is really important and the content is really important and how that's delivered is really important. But if I'm in a state where I am perceiving a lot of threat, I feel like I can't be myself or ask questions, if I'm in this kind of survival state, it doesn't really matter what gets delivered to me or what I engage in. I'm probably not going to learn much. Or if I do learn, it will probably be stuff that helps me cope in the short term, or it might be potentially maladaptive coping strategies. So the experience is really key, and we wrap around that what the characteristics of the physical, social and psychological environment that's there. How do we make that informed by some sort of curriculum? So some idea of what it is that we're trying to develop and how we do that. And then this idea of being individual informed, because if you understand the personal history and personality and development profile and the strengths of the athlete, then you can make all that work in synergy. But yeah, I'm completely in line with what you're saying around, if we start with the experience, then everything can feed off by that. So I don't know if I'm based just on what I've lived so far, whether athletes are always the right people to say what's best for their performance.
Sure.
They are definitely the right people to say what's best for them. And when we do need to ask more frequent questions to them directly around how do you want this to go? How are you experiencing this? But yeah, I do completely agree that get the intended experience right and continue to check in and work with that. Gives you so much insight and so much context that allows you to make good decisions. And I've always said that context makes you better at your job.
I suppose it's that sweet spot between autonomy supportive and controlled, isn't it? From a very basic perspective, if we were to use that with relation to organisations, I love your model there, and I think if we just help the audience sort of picture that, so smack bang in the middle is player experience, and then you've got the physical and psychological and social behaviours around that. Would that be right to say that? And then a curriculum around that. Did I hear you correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we think of a curriculum, what are we trying to achieve here? And then we can create that with reference to player experience. So we've got to go into the middle of the model, and then to the outskirts of the model, and then back into the middle and to the outskirts. So you're kind of trying to be quite nimble, aren't you, as a performance director? You're trying to have that communication with an athlete. Say, well, what would you like? What would you want from us? And this athlete says, well, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do. Whereas you've got another athlete who says, well, I really want to be in charge here. I don't trust that coach over there. I want to be in charge. I know me best. And you deal with a range of personalities in that respect, don't you? But as a performance director, you've got an expertise, and you've got coaches with expertise who have years of experience, and they know what high performance looks like in the sport. You might have 100 years of experience in the room, and they know what it looks like. They've seen what works and what doesn't work by and large. But you've got this group of individual athletes as well, and we've got to take into account there. So it's almost doing a dance across that model to be able to find the right specific solutions for the individuals and the group as a whole.
Yeah, 100%, and that's why the primary, I guess, way of thinking that we established in Canoe was, can we have a psychologically informed environment that is at its very heart about people and relationships, but is driven towards performance. Everything else is secondary, not because it's not important, but it's because we won't let an idea of a fixed model of delivery be the thing that influences how we work with people. We won't let rigid ideas about what good looks like dictate our practice. They will inform our practice, but what will dictate our practice is the extent to which we are meeting the unique psychological and emotional needs of the people who work in our system. And that, for me, in my experience, yielded great success from learning well-being and performance perspectives with the athletes and staff we work with.
I love that term, psychologically informed environment. So is that, in essence, everybody having an understanding of some psychological frameworks? Obviously, you've made the statement, people and relationships towards performance. So the understanding, the nurturing of people and their relationships driving towards performance. How much of it is theory in your experience, and how much of it is applied? You know, do you think that coaches and performance directors have to have a real good knowledge of psychological frameworks? Is that what PIE is? PIE, you know, psychologically informed environments, or is it more experiential than that? Is it sort of more? Is it less theoretical and more practical?
I found, and keep in mind, I had no formal training on this through my development as a sports psych.
So it's very experiential for you.
It was experiential for me, but the process in itself is what I would consider a marriage between the two. So a properly psychologically informed environment will encourage you to work within not exclusively one, but a collection of psychological models, a way of understanding the world. But it's driven by applied factors. So it's a way of working with people. It's a way of orchestrating an environment. I really like it because there are some things that I've experienced in psychology where when you get these moments when you feel like you've got to sell it, you do in quite an abstract way and then drive down to the practical. But I've always experienced with this PIES approach that it's born out of challenges faced on the ground, and then it's a way of connecting it to existing theory as and where that theory is appropriate. So I found it a really nice way of working. It was the easiest sell I've ever had with coaches and leaders when I was in Canoe, because it wasn't about providing a way of explaining the world and then waiting for a problem to arise and then saying this is how this theory solves that problem.
Okay.
It was more around how do we make sense of the problems that we're experiencing. And for me, that was a quick get in with everybody, because everybody wanted to support athletes as best they could, and they could relate to problems because they were the people experiencing those problems. So we would bring challenges and problems and questions to the table and then build back from there in what would be referred to in psychology as a formulation process. And then we would use that to guide or underpin the psychological environment that we continuously try to create.
A formulation process.
Can
you explain that for me?
Yeah, I think it will probably be most commonly, the closest thing that people might relate to is this idea of a needs analysis.
Okay.
But it's more holistic and it's more theory driven, I guess, in that sense. So what you do is you identify a problem, or a challenge that's being faced. So in some cases, that might be a behavioural or emotional problem. So I'll use an example to bring this to life. So one that we had an athlete who was presenting a range of behaviours. So linking back to what I was saying before about noise, she's a very noisy athlete. So a lot of stress, a lot of emotion, really struggled to hold emotion. So when she was stressed, everybody knew about it. Because
she sounds like me as a golfer, but carry on.
Yeah. Found everything inherently threatening, which made it difficult to take feedback, made it difficult to take risks. So the process was, okay, well, how might we best understand these behaviours? Let's not just jump to she needs to work with a psych on her emotional control. How might we understand these presenting behaviours? And there's a process that you go through. There are different types of formulations. I mean, it seems to be relatively new, but it's pretty common practice in other psych disciplines, particularly in clinical psych. You can do individual formulations. We always took a team formulation approach, which was that we would get the whole support team in a room to then provide perspective and experience, and then build up this picture of where this behaviour might be coming from. And the process encourages you to look through the factors that might be encouraging or maintaining this kind of behaviour from an individual perspective or a team perspective. So we might say, well, this athlete, what do we know about her and her life story that might help us make sense out of what we're seeing? Then you kind of go through this process. You're like, well, what might we be doing? How might she be experiencing our environment and our behaviour that might be triggering this kind of behaviour from her? It was a real leveller because it forced people to take into account the things that might be either predisposing or maintaining athlete behaviour, and it stopped the usual stuff you get. I don't know if you've had this, Dan. I had quite a lot of labelling or diagnosing. So on the basis of behaviour, that athlete isn't resilient. I'm going to hire you as a sports psych to develop their resilience. Or he can't control his emotions. Can you do some mental skills training to do that? But what we did was, through this formulation process, is create this picture that helped us understand behaviour. And in almost all circumstances, everything made sense. And that helped us come to the conclusion that all behaviour is understandable in context. So whilst something might be looking challenging or confusing, or where the hell did that just come from, everything makes sense in the story and experience of that person living it. And the formulation was just a way of bringing that to life. And then off the back of that, we would then say, well, how do we try and structure this environment that so it might be a bit more psychologically informed, that would allow us to better manage that behaviour when it presents itself, support the athlete in developing any skills they might need to develop in order to manage those experiences, or change aspects of the relationships and environmental features that are inherent in our place that seem to trigger this off. So yeah, it was just a really, really useful way of operating, and it's come to be the way that I consider good applied psychology in a performance setting.
As you were speaking there, I was picturing a meeting with heads of department, key stakeholders within departments, having a conversation to help each other make sense of that player and having an understanding that that player has a history, having an understanding that what we do in our departments, us as heads of department, us or our staff are going to impact and influence, the behaviours of this person, this player, this athlete, and striving to find integrated solutions.
Yeah.
A sense making, and I know sense making is a term that can be sort of used in other areas, but making sense and integration are the two key words or phrases for me that come out of what you've just said, and I just think it's bang on. And I just think of, you said you have a background in doing stuff in football, and I think British football needs to have more meetings like this, more conversations like this, rather than jumping to conclusions and making assumptions. And boy, I think both you and I are invested in wanting sports psychologists to be used more within sport, of course, but it's how do we get utilised, and it needs to be it's preferably within an integrated solution, rather than this athlete has a problem in inverted commas, or this athlete needs to improve, go and see the sports psych.
And it's just such an easy way to think about problems when we work in a performance setting, because you can observe someone's technique and break it down and identify the factors that are causing that to work well or not well, and you can diagnose and you can correct. We can do that in the gym. To some extent, we can do that to routines and lifestyle behaviours, but we have this way of thinking about psychology in this country. And I say this country because I've only experienced this country. It might be different elsewhere. But I always notice that there's this kind of underlying need to justify yourself. That if we are able to diagnose, if we are able to medicalise stuff, it somehow makes it more sciencey, which somehow makes it more right. Whereas when you try and apply broad behavioural and performance issues into a medical model, it doesn't work. Like, quite often we're not working with medical issues, we're not working with mental illnesses, although in some cases we do, but broadly speaking the work isn't about that. So it doesn't really make sense to try and apply a medical model to common behaviours. So what I found really nice about the introduction of formulation and pies into my work was that it just stripped back any need to diagnose, and it actually discouraged diagnoses. And what that did for me was it opened up a whole new way of practice. And the way that I conducted myself in canoe was to almost position myself as the guardian of athlete experience and the orchestrator of the environment. So I would spend most of my time chatting to athletes about how is it going, what have you experienced, talk me through how that went. I would watch every training session, and I would work across 4 or 5 different squads. So sometimes when squad A were training, squad B weren't, and that's when they wanted to book their one-to-one time. But I'd almost had to hold it really tightly that it's more important for me to get out and watch training, because context makes me better at my job. And if I don't see what you've gone through, how can I talk to you authentically about it? All I will get is just your account, your memory of that, if we manage to get a bit of time together next week to talk about it. But what I also get to do is see how things are moving around in the environment. I get to hear coach interactions. I get to hear athletes talk amongst each other and talk to coaches. And you can hear the frustrations and you can see the fist bumps when things go well. And like, you just absorb all of that rich information that allows you to make sense of, well, what's that environment that someone's been in today? This feels like a really positive vibe. I've seen a lot of backslapping. I've seen a lot of congratulating athletes are coaching each other, which is really nice to see. Coach looks happy and relaxed. Do you know what I mean? But I can't get any of that if I'm stuck in a meeting room. I also can't feed back to the coach on anything because we've got nothing in common, because I've not seen his training session. So we will have a catch up over a coffee because we get on well and we know that our work supports each other. And I can talk to him or her about how it's all going. But it's so much better just to be in the environment, but just slightly away so you're not interfering, which I could do really easily at the lake because there was a a balcony.
There wasn't a spare canoe that you could jump into.
Do you know what there was? There was enough times the girls said, well, if you actually want to know what it's like, get in the boat.
How did you get out of that one?
Well, I managed to do it on a training camp in Portugal when it was like 30 degrees. Definitely wasn't up for doing that on a nice day.
Where's your mental toughness, mate? Come on, we need to work on some mental skills there. That's disgraceful. No, I don't blame you at all.
Yeah, that's what it is. And then suddenly the quality of conversations I was having with coaches just went through the roof. It was like, I noticed you did this today. And because we'd had a formulation, because we'd had agreed actions, because we had a shared understanding of the athlete and the environment we wanted to create, we had something to talk to.
Yeah.
It's like, when we said it was going to be really important to not be seen to overly criticise, talk to me about how that played out, because when I watched that, my interpretation was that they took that as some quite heavy criticism. And when you went off to go coach that other athlete, I noticed this change in behaviour or whatever it was. And then all of a sudden, your job is to draw in information from your observations and your discussions from athletes, and then nudge, provoke, talk with coaches, raise their self-awareness, support them through their perceptions and what they might do next or what they're doing that's working really well. And you almost just keep your finger on the pulse of the environment. And I had more joy with doing that than any kind of one-to-one stuff that was just felt like people were doing and I felt I was doing just because that's what I was meant to be doing as the psych. And then the one-to-one stuff you do, that it is more likely to be a genuine, authentic, individual development intervention, as opposed to just helping someone manage some aspects of the environment that they find difficult, that in itself would be quite easy to change.
It's authentic, it's integrated, it's delivered in... There's more chance of delivering it in the language of the athlete in front of you. And you're just a more informed person in general about the specific challenges that athletes face. I think it's a really interesting one for sports psychologists, and I don't want to dwell on this for too long because I'm aware that there are only X amount of sports psychologists listening in, and there's lots of coaches and participants themselves who will be listening in, and this is a specific sports psychologist's challenge, is how much do you get to know about your sport? I mean, you're kind of alluding to the importance of being in context and so being able to provide an integrative solution. I know that. But I've always found it an interesting one, the dichotomy between a sports psychologist coming in fresh to an environment and delivering stuff, and the power of that because you're not biased at all, because you don't have this deep history in the sport, and actually sometimes you can see things that coaches can't because they're so entrenched within the culture of the sport themselves. Yes, at the same time I know it can be so your efficacy as a coach, your ability as a sports psychologist, your ability to deliver as a sports psychologist can improve loads. When you do know the sport, when you do know the language, you do know the specific challenges that players face. I do think that, I'd like to think I'm quite a good psychologist within golf, because I've stood on the first tee, and played under pressure, and because, I've been a professional golfer now, I know that's not essential and perhaps not necessary, but it can help as well. So I suppose what I'm saying is I see both sides.
Yeah. And the point I'd make on what you said just there, Dan, because I think you're right, it's really easy to qualify this as a sports psychologist's challenge. I'm not entirely convinced that you need a sports psychologist on hand to have a psychologically informed environment. And whilst you might need a psych input to help raise awareness of some of the concepts and ways of working,
sure.
My vision was always to make the support staff fully functioning, and you can do that. And it's more about the psychology that's inherent in people's work, not the psychology that the psychologist does, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Brilliant stuff. Well, I just want to finish on, I was having a look at your Twitter page, and I picked up two quotes that bear some relationship with each other, but I also think they're kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm creating this in my own mind, that they feel conflicting as well, and I just wondered where you stand here, because, you know, we've talked about athletes' needs, and we've talked about environment and mental skills. So you've posted a quote by, I'm going to try and get this pronunciation right, Alexander Den Heijer, who's an inspirational speaker, and the quote is this: "When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower." And then you've got, not so much, well, maybe one could call it a quote, but at the very top of your Twitter page, you've got a, well, we'll call it a quote that says, "Your character will be tested on your journey to success. Your character will be tested on your journey to success." And it's interesting because that quote to me speaks to the competitor, to the athlete. You know, your character is going to be tested. And it suggests to me that you're speaking to the athlete and you're saying, you know, you have to be flexible with your character. You have to have the skill, whether it's the mental skill or the behavioural flexibility, to deal with this really tough journey. And yet, with the Alexander Den Heijer quote, it's very much about the environment. You know, it's not that the athlete has to fix themselves; it's that the environment has to complement the competitor. So I suppose my question to you is, where do you stand on that? What's more important? Is it the environment, or is it the capacity of the competitor, the athlete, to deal with the environment they're in?
I mean, both are highly relevant, and actually one of the reasons why I posted that environment one was because it formed part of my introduction to the environments workshop, which was more around, can we think critically about statements like this rather than just retweet them?
Oh, okay. So you see, my assumption. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those that always looks like a kind of endorsement, doesn't it? But coming back to your really good question, I do believe quite strongly that the environment is the place in which character is developed. So what I'm not suggesting is that we have environments that are happy and easy and are snowplowed to make athletes' journeys easier. Part of the environment might be to have some well-coordinated and well-informed doses of challenge. And it might be the education, the development and implementation of various psychosocial skills to manage that. Because if we end up just having really nice environments, we'll just develop people that are really happy. And that's cool if that's what you're about, but that's not a high performance system. So it's almost what I was saying before. How do you have a psychologically informed environment that's driven towards performance? Well, we got some insight into what it takes to perform at that level, and that involves some things around resilience, emotional control, having overcome adversity, loads and loads of other things. So the environment needs to be able to provide opportunities for people to develop those things in what you would hope would be a really integrated and well-informed way, not just a really relentless environment that's, you know, good for the people that can cope and kills off anybody who can't. So again, I've done that psych thing where I've said it's a bit of both.
It is, yeah.
And it is definitely about character. I think I'm inspired by people who throw their hands up and say, I want to be the best in the world at something. I just think that's amazing. And to commit to that every day, when in our Olympic and Paralympic world, they don't get paid a lot. It's very much a life purpose, a passion endeavour. So they need the best opportunity to develop the things that are going to take them there. And some people get along that journey and say, right, this ain't for me. Doesn't mean that you're a bad person or there's something wrong with you. It just means that this ridiculously ambitious goal that you set for yourself hasn't quite worked out. But we do need certain character traits to be able to do that. But we shouldn't in my mind, as the environment's quote is saying, is consider the fact that they didn't perform something because of them, and not look at ourselves first.
Sure.
So yeah, I think in a way it's a nice mismatch between the two. But yeah, definitely environments in my mind are the breeding ground for learning and the development of that character.
Fascinating, and I know that you've got some really good thriving models that you've posted on Twitter. So how can people get hold of you, mate? How can they follow you? Where can they get some information on your work?
Yeah, I do say thrive a lot.
Well, you actually say in your mini biography on Twitter that you say thrive a lot. So how can people listen to you talking about thriving?
Well, they can. Most of our events are for Olympic and Paralympic sport. So if you're in that world, give me a shout. If you're not, also give me a shout, and we just might need to set something up slightly different. But people can follow me on Twitter. It's Elliott Sportsci. And if people want to email me, it's elliot.newell@eistowin.co.uk. And I will happily talk all day to anyone who's interested in thriving or psychologically informed environments.
Brilliant, fantastic. Well, Elliot, mate, thank you so much for that. Took a ton of notes there, and certainly be taking away some of those things into the environments I'm working in. Everybody, that was Elliott Newell. I really, really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd really love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter, or you can get in touch with me via Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, and let me know what you think of the Sports Psych show. And if you have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.